Sourdough bread. Dead easy, only needs about 15 minutes of your time. The rest of it is fermenting and proving. So what do you need? Well, first, a large mixing bowl. This one's enormous because I make 3 loaves of bread at a time. You don't have to do that though. Next, a plastic dough scraper. Makes it much easier handling dough on a surface. Bread flours. I use a mix of 2/3 strong or very strong white bread flour and 1/3 strong wholemeal flour. Available in most supermarkets. And of course the starter. This is just a mix of rye flour and water that over time becomes a teeming environment of yeasts and beneficial bacteria. I'll show you how to get one going from scratch in another video. I've had this one on the go for about 2 years. You have to feed it like a pet. I keep mine in the fridge, and every 2 or 3 days I feed it with more flour and water, which keeps the fermenting process going and builds up the amount you need to bake with. It ferments slower in the fridge, so the day before bread making I'll wake it up by adding some more rye flour, about that much, the exact amount isn't crucial, and a bit of room temperature water, and stir it all up till it's well combined. It should look like a sort of sloppy porridge, and just adjust it with more water or flour if you need to. So that gives the yeast and bacteria something to feed on. And the lid goes on, and that stays at room temperature to ferment and get reactivated and ready for business. I tend to do it in the morning and leave it for 18 to 24 hours so that it's ready to use the following morning. And 24 hours later, this is what it looks like. Frothy and bubbling with a sort of boozy smell to it. Lovely. Okay, got everything we need, let's go. I'm making 3 loaves. So 300 grams of starter goes into the bowl first. That's 100 grams per loaf if you're making fewer. Then 500 grams of strong white bread flour. That's about 160 grams per loaf. And 250 grams of strong wholemeal bread flour, or about 85 grams per loaf. Then 850 millilitres, which is 850 grams by weight, of tepid water, or that's 280 mils per loaf. Make sure this is only just tepid. It should be just a bit more than room temperature, but you don't want it to be too warm, otherwise the starter yeast will find it too uncomfortable. Then roll up your sleeves and get your hand in there and start stirring it around. Incorporating it all gently. Only takes a minute, but make sure it's all evenly mixed. Add a bit more water if you need to. You want it to be another sloppy porridge, but not quite as sloppy as the starter itself. And scrape yourself off. Then use your dough scraper to skirt round the bowl, getting it all into the mixture. This stage is called the sponge, and we're going to leave this out at room temperature, stored loosely in a plastic bag, something big enough to take the mixing bowl. We're going to leave that for 10 to 12 hours. I tend to do all this in the morning and it's ready for the next stage by about 9 PM that evening, but equally you could leave it out overnight. One little task before you finish this stage though. Now that you're done with your starter, give it another feed with some more rye flour and water. And we'll be putting this in the fridge, and every few days we'll be getting it out and repeating this process. As I mentioned earlier, this is basically to give the yeast something to feed on. Put the lid on and put it back in the fridge. So, 10 to 12 hours later, what have we got? Well, the yeasts and bacteria have been digesting and fermenting the flour, and we've got this thick bubbling mass, very sticky, a bit like jelly. I'm getting a few other ingredients to hand now, some olive oil or rapeseed oil, some fine sea salt, which must be proper salt by the way, not just low salt, and if you want, some seeds of some kind. I'm going to add pumpkin seeds to this loaf. Okay, now we're going to add some more flour. 600 grams of strong white bread flour, or 200 grams per loaf. 300 grams of wholemeal strong bread flour, or 100 grams per loaf. And 20 grams of fine sea salt, or 7 grams per loaf. Here's where you can chuck in your seeds if you're adding them. And then a dollop of oil. This isn't strictly necessary, but it's just to improve the texture of the bread, make it a little bit more silky. Now taking the dough scraper, we want to gently start combining that lot. Gradually working the dry flour into the wetter ingredients. Takes a few minutes. Until eventually we're at a stage where we can turn the whole lot out onto the work surface. Now we want to gradually bring it all together using the dough scraper. And you can start to use both hands. It will become gradually more workable and less chaotic. And after a minute or so, it starts to become kneadable. And now we're going to start stretching it out and folding like this. So your left hand holds the back of the dough while using the heel of your right hand to stretch the other end away from you. And on each pass of that, you're turning it over, folding the sides into the middle, and repeating the process. You want to keep this up for about 7 to 8 minutes. Stretching, folding, stretching, folding. And eventually we'll get to a state where it's smooth and elastic like this. And we're going to put it back in the bowl, but we're going to add a little dollop of cooking oil first and then just turn the dough around in it. That's to stop it sticking to the bowl. And that's going to go back in our bag and ferment for another 10 to 12 hours or overnight. And the next morning, or after your 10 to 12 hours, this is what we have. The dough is risen. Now you can prove your bread in bannetons, but I'm going to put them straight in baking tins, and I'm going to sprinkle the base of them with a little polenta or cornmeal just to prevent sticking. Although actually these tins are non-stick anyway. Now I'm going to scrape the risen dough out of the bowl. And I'm going to divide it into 3. Then for each one, I'm just going to knock it back and do another quick fold and shape them to fit the tins. For their final stage before baking, we're going to cover them with oil cling film because they're going to go and rise for another couple of hours. And the cling film will keep the draft off them. Then they just need to rise for a couple of hours in a warm place. I'm going to use my airing cupboard, but if you don't have one, anywhere warm is fine. Finally, let's get the oven on. You want 250 degrees Celsius or whatever your maximum is. And you'll be wanting to bake on the middle shelf. Once the oven's hot, fetch them down. Being very careful with them. You don't want to knock the air out. Into the oven. And if you have one, get a water spray bottle and spray the inside of the oven with lashings of water mist. This keeps the oven interior moist and means the crusts won't form so quickly, meaning they'll rise a bit more. Set an alarm for 10 minutes later, at which point you will turn the oven down to 200 degrees Celsius. 25 minutes later, the bread is done. Once it's cool, you can turn it out onto a wire rack.